Somewhere in America, in the years around the turn of the last century, a boiler exploded, on average, more than once a week. Not a fire, not a machinery accident. A boiler, tearing itself open and hurling iron plate the weight of a delivery wagon through solid brick like it was paper. More than 2,000 of these failures were logged across roughly 1 decade of records in this country alone, and you are about to spend the next 10 hours standing 3 feet from one. Here's the number that makes it worse. The boiler above your head right now is holding back 150 pounds of pressure on every single square inch of curved iron, packed inside a shell of riveted steel plate that's been heating, cooling, for going on 15 years. Multiply that pressure across the whole shell, and you're talking about a force strong enough to lift a locomotive clean off its tracks, held in place by rivets, patience, and whatever's left of a 15-year-old weld. You walk down a flight of iron stairs into a room built to hide from daylight. Behind a cast-iron door, something roars. Orange, furious, hungry for coal, more of it, always more. For the next 10 hours, you'll feed it like a man feeding an animal that would take his hand off given half a chance. But the fire isn't what's actually going to kill you. The fire you can see, you can hear, you can respect from a healthy distance. The thing that wants you dead is invisible. It's the pressure sitting quietly behind that iron shell, and the only proof it exists at all is a needle on a dial and a glass tube of water no wider than your thumb. Lie to yourself about either one of those, even for 30 seconds, and the room you're standing in right now can turn into a crater. None of this should have been possible. An iron drum, a coal fire, and one exhausted, underpaid laborer. For decades, that was the entire safety plan standing between an American factory and a headline. No license required in most towns. No mandatory inspection with real teeth behind it. Just a man, a gauge, and a glass tube, holding back 150 pounds per square inch on nothing but attention and nerve. It shouldn't have worked. For a very long time, it barely did. So here's what this room is going to ask of you today, and it's not going to ask nicely. Could you read a gauge that's quietly lying to you? Could you trust a safety valve you haven't personally tested in months? Could you keep your head in the one kind of emergency down here that arrives as a blast of scalding steam instead of a sound, faster than a scream, faster than a single step toward the door? Could you actually stand where the men who kept this country running stood, watch exactly what they watched, and make it to quitting time with your body still in one piece? By the end of this shift, you'll know exactly what it took, and you'll understand why, in a room this quiet, this many men never made it home. You'll notice something else before your eyes even adjust to the dark down here. Nobody upstairs ever comes to see this room. The women running the stitching machines, the men at the lasting benches, the office clerks 2 floors up. None of them will ever set foot down these stairs in their entire working lives. They'll never see the fire, never hear the gauge, never once think about the fact that everything they depend on to earn a wage today is sitting on top of 150 pounds of pressure, tended by someone they've never met. That's the deal this room makes with the rest of the building. You carry the risk. They get to forget it exists. The room that kills faster than you can scream. Start with what you can survive. The heat alone will try to wear you down slowly. Boiler rooms in this era regularly climb past 120 degrees near the firebox doors. Hot enough that grown men wrap rags around bare hands just to touch tools they use every 10 minutes. That's the easy part. That's just misery, and misery you can survive. Here's what you can't out-tough. If the water inside that boiler drops even a few inches below where it's supposed to sit, a matter of minutes of inattention, nothing more. The top of the firebox goes from submerged and cool to bare and glowing in almost no time at all. Metal that was built to carry water starts carrying nothing but flame, and metal asked to hold back 150 pounds of pressure per square inch, while it's got fire licking its bare underside, does not fail quietly. It fails all at once. When it does, water sitting calm and liquid 1 heartbeat earlier turns to steam so fast the change looks less like boiling and more like a detonation in its own right. The same physics as a kettle, just concentrated into a fraction of a second instead of stretched across a slow afternoon. That expansion doesn't ask the boiler shell for permission. It goes through it. Riveted plate, brick chimney, timber flooring, whatever's in the way goes with it. And here's the fact that should keep you up tonight. This isn't rare. In the years around the turn of the century, boiler explosions were common enough that insurance men kept ledgers of them the way you'd keep a ledger of bad weather. Not 2,000 small leaks. 2,000 violent failures. In factories, exactly like the one you're standing in right now. You want the number that should really scare you? Speed. A shout of warning can't outrun a bullet. And a boiler failure at full pressure moves on that same kind of timescale. There is no slow leak, no groan of metal, no 10-second countdown where you get to run for the door. One moment the room is exactly as boring as it was 5 minutes ago. The next moment, if the worst happens, it simply isn't there anymore. And in some recorded cases, neither is the crew standing next to it. We're not going to explain yet exactly how a fireman is supposed to stop that from happening. That comes later. The water gauge, the fusible plug, the safety valve, the whole quiet arsenal of 19th century engineering standing between you and the wreckage. For now, just sit with the shape of the danger. It's not the coal, it's not the burns, it's not even the noise, though the noise in this room never really stops. It's the fact that on an ordinary Monday morning in Massachusetts, a boiler almost exactly like this one let go while a shift was walking in the door, and by the time anyone understood what was happening, 58 of them were already dead. We'll come back to that morning. It's the reason this video exists, and it's the reason every fact from here forward circles back to one plain question. If you'd been standing where that boiler's engineer stood, would you have made it out? One more fact, and then we'll go to work. The men who did this job for a living rarely got any formal warning that they were in danger until the day they weren't. There was no license requirement in most towns, no mandatory inspection schedule with real teeth behind it. A boiler could pass its yearly check with a hidden crack sitting exactly where the inspector's eye could never reach it, buried inside the overlap of two riveted plates, widening with every cycle of heat and cool, waiting. That's the room you're walking into, not a factory. A room where every ordinary decision, how much coal, how much water, how long you can afford to look away, sits on top of 150 pounds of pressure per square inch, and absolutely no margin for a mistake. The job that kept the whole factory alive. Before you can understand why you're standing in this room, you have to understand the problem it solved. For most of the 18th century, and a good stretch of the 19th, a factory could only exist wherever the water was. Water wheels turned mills. No river, no power, no factory. It was that simple. And it meant industry stayed chained to riverbanks whether the location made economic sense or not. Steam broke that chain. Build a fire, boil water, and you could run a factory anywhere a rail line or a wagon road could deliver coal. In the middle of a city, next to a labor pool of thousands, far from any river at all. By the 1880s and 90s, that single idea had rewired American industry. Mills that once needed a waterfall now needed nothing but a boiler room and a man willing to work it. And that man was you. Somebody had to feed the fire that made the steam, that turned the shaft, that ran the belts, that spun every machine on every floor above your head. Not glamorous work. Not even particularly respected work most of the time. Firemen and stationary engineers were paid a fraction of what skilled machinists earned, even though the entire operation depended on them never making a mistake. But without this room, nothing upstairs moves. Not one loom, not one lathe, not one line shaft. You are, whether anyone upstairs thinks about it or not, the reason the whole building is alive today. In a bigger plant, you won't be alone down here. And the hierarchy matters. The chief engineer holds the license, carries the legal responsibility, and makes the calls when something looks wrong. Under him, a fireman like you tends the actual fire, shoveling, raking, watching. In the largest operations, a coal passer works beneath even you, hauling fuel from the bunker so you never have to leave the firing line to fetch it yourself. In a smaller factory, all three of those jobs might collapse down into one exhausted man wearing all three hats at once, which means there's nobody left to catch the mistake you don't notice you're making. So on your first morning, someone hands you a shovel and points you toward a door radiating heat you can feel from 10 feet away, and that's roughly the extent of your formal training. Maybe you're lucky, and there's an older man already working the floor, a fireman who's done this for years, who reads a fire the way a farmer reads weather, who'll tell you which sounds mean nothing and which ones mean get out. Maybe you're not lucky, and you're learning this room by trial, which down here is another way of saying by luck. Either way, here's your first lesson, and it's the only one that actually matters. The fire wants to be fed constantly, evenly, and with total attention. The water level wants to be watched every single minute you're on shift. Neither one forgives you for looking away. You open the firebox door, carefully, because standing in front of it even for a second sends heat straight into your face, like an oven turned up past anything a kitchen would ever need, and you see coals glowing orange across an iron grate. Your job is to keep that fire burning hot enough, even enough, and consistently enough to boil water at a rate the whole factory can depend on, hour after hour, without you ever quite deciding you've earned a break. The old-timers have terms for everything down here, and you'll learn them fast because your safety depends on it. Clinkers, the fused lumps of ash and melted mineral that choke off airflow to the fire and have to be broken apart with an iron bar before they smother your whole grate. The slice bar, the rake, the pricker, the tools you use to do that breaking, each one wrapped in rag at the handle because bare metal near an open firebox door will blister your palm in seconds. And the gauge glass, a slender tube of water mounted on the boiler's side that's the only honest witness in the room, showing you exactly where the water level sits, no matter what any other instrument claims. You'll be told, on day one, to trust that glass tube over almost anything else down here. You'll understand why soon enough, because gauges can lie, valves can stick, and pressure has a way of building in silence, while every other sign in the room insists everything is fine. But right now, on your first morning, none of that has cost anyone anything yet. Right now it's just heat and noise and a shovel with your name on it and a fire that needs feeding before it starts eating into the water it's supposed to be boiling instead of the metal around it. So you get to work. And somewhere in the walls of this room, 150 pounds of pressure per square inch is quietly building toward the only number that actually matters today. And you haven't even learned yet what that number can do. 150 pounds on every square inch. So what, exactly, is this room fighting, minute to keep from turning into wreckage? Start simple. Water boils. Everybody knows that. But inside a sealed iron vessel, water doesn't just boil and drift away as steam into open air the way it does in a kettle on a stove. It's trapped. And trapped steam, heated further and further by a fire that never lets up, starts pushing back against the walls of its container with real force. Force that by the turn of the century, in a typical factory boiler, had climbed to somewhere around 150 pounds, pressing on every single square inch of the boiler's interior. Multiply that across a shell the size of a small rail car, and you're talking about a combined force strong enough to lift a locomotive clean off its tracks. That force isn't the enemy. That force is the entire point. It's what turns the line shaft, what runs the belts, what keeps the whole factory upstairs employed. The enemy is what happens the moment that force stops being contained the way it's supposed to be. Here's the chain you're responsible for, start to finish. Coal burns in the firebox, underneath and around a shell of iron that's supposed to be fully submerged in water at all times. Heat passes from that fire, through the metal, into the water, and turns it to steam. That steam collects at the top of the boiler, in a space called the steam drum, and travels out through pipe to wherever the factory needs it. A steam engine turning a massive overhead line shaft, which drives leather belts, which spin pulleys, which turn every single machine on every floor above your head. Every link in that chain depends on one condition holding true every second of your shift. The metal touching fire has to stay covered in water. Always. No exceptions. No 5-minute grace periods. No benefit of the doubt. So what happens if it isn't covered? This is the fact Chapter 1 made you sit with, and now you get the mechanism behind it. The section of the firebox that sits at the very top, engineers call it the crown sheet, is designed assuming water is pressed against its far side, constantly pulling heat away and keeping the metal at a temperature it can safely hold. Drop the water level even a little, and that same sheet of metal is suddenly touching nothing but fire and superheated gas. It doesn't take long, minutes, sometimes less. The metal weakens, softens, loses the strength it needs to hold back 150 pounds per square inch. And when it finally gives, whatever water is still sitting nearby hits that exposed, overheated surface and flashes into steam almost instantly, expanding to something on the order of 1,700 times its liquid volume in the time it takes you to blink. That's not a slow rupture. That's a detonation using nothing but water and heat as its explosive charge, and the boiler shell around it, riveted iron plate never designed to contain that kind of instantaneous force, simply cannot hold. But surely, you're thinking, there are ways to catch this before it happens. And you'd be right. This era of engineering wasn't blind to the danger. It built an entire quiet arsenal of devices meant to warn you, or save you, in exactly this moment. You just have to trust them, use them, and never once assume they'll do their job without your help. The gauge glass is your first line of defense, and it's beautifully simple. A slender tube of water mounted outside the boiler shell, connected top and bottom to the water and steam inside, showing you the true water level at a glance. No math, no guesswork. If the water in that little tube drops toward the bottom mark, the water in the boiler is dropping right along with it, and you have minutes, not hours, to respond. Below the gauge glass, a row of tricocks gives you a second, cruder way to check. Small valves you crack open one at a time to see whether water or dry steam comes hissing out. A manual backup for exactly the moment you don't trust what the glass is telling you. Then there's the fusible plug, and this one only works when everything else has already failed. It's a small metal plug set directly into the crown sheet itself, filled with a soft alloy that melts at a specific, carefully chosen temperature. As long as water covers it, that plug stays cool and solid. But if the water drops low enough to expose the crown sheet, the plug is the first thing to feel it. It melts, and steam comes screaming through the hole it leaves behind, straight into the firebox, straight at you. An alarm made of scalding vapor instead of sound, because by the time sound would reach you, sound would already be too late. And finally, the safety valve, the last mechanical argument against catastrophe. A spring-loaded or weighted device, sitting on top of the boiler shell, that's supposed to lift automatically the instant pressure climbs past its rated limit, venting excess steam into open air before the shell itself is forced to do the venting for it. It should work every time. It doesn't always. Corrosion, scale, neglect. A valve nobody's manually tested in months. Any one of those can leave a safety valve stuck exactly when you need it most, silent and useless, while the needle on the pressure gauge keeps climbing past every number it was ever supposed to touch. That's the mechanism behind the fact that opened this video, the reason a failure down here can outrun a scream. But knowing how the danger works isn't the same as knowing whether it can be beaten. Hold on to that. It's still an open question. So there's your machine. 4 separate safeguards, layered one on top of another, standing between an ordinary Tuesday and a headline. And every single one of them depends on something this era of engineering could never fully guarantee. A human being, standing exactly where you're standing right now, paying attention. None of that means the room is quiet in the meantime. Fittings work themselves loose under the constant expansion and contraction of heating and cooling. A joint that was tight last week can be weeping steam this week, and steam escaping through even a pinhole gap doesn't look like much to the eye. It's nearly invisible, especially in the gloom down here, but it's hot enough to cut through skin and clothing before you feel a thing. Old hands learn to sweep a broom handle or a rag through the air near a suspected leak, rather than reach in with a bare hand, because by the time your nerves report the burn, the damage is already done. It's a small danger next to a full boiler failure, but it's a danger you'll meet far more often. And it teaches you the same lesson every other hazard down here teaches you. In this room, you don't trust your senses first. You trust the tool. There's one more weakness, and it's the quietest one of all. The boiler shell itself is built from curved iron plates, riveted together at overlapping seams, called lap joints. One plate laid over the edge of the next, punched through with rivets, sealed as tight as 19th century metalwork allowed. It's a strong design. It's also a design with a blind spot. If a crack begins to form at the edge where those two plates overlap, it grows hidden, invisible to an inspector's eye, no matter how carefully he looks, because the flaw sits between two layers of metal that were never meant to be pulled apart for a checkup. A boiler can pass its inspection with a flying grade and still be carrying a fracture that's been widening, quietly, for years. Keep that fact in your pocket. You're going to need it later. On the morning we finally walk you through exactly how a failure that starts as a rounding error on a gauge ends as one of the deadliest industrial disasters this country had ever recorded. For now, your shift is still young, the fire's still hungry, and none of this has gone wrong yet. It's just sitting there, patient, 150 pounds on every square inch, waiting to find out whether you're paying attention. 10 hours, one shovel, no margin for error. By hour 2, your body has already started negotiating with you, and it's going to keep negotiating for the rest of the shift. A standard workday in a room like this ran 10 hours, sometimes 12, and for most of it, you're either shoveling, raking, or watching, never quite resting, because a boiler room doesn't grant intermissions. Each shovel load of coal weighs somewhere around 30 or 40 pounds, and a skilled fireman doesn't dump it in one careless heap. He spreads it thin, and even across the whole grate, because an uneven fire burns unevenly, and an unevenly burning fire is harder to predict, harder to control, and more likely to do something you didn't ask it to do. That's the difference, the old-timers will tell you, between a good fireman and a bad one. A good fireman can run the same boiler on noticeably less coal than a bad one, because he understands the fire instead of just feeding it. You'll learn that the hard way, one blistered palm at a time. Every so often, the fire needs cleaning. Ash builds up beneath the grate. Clinkers choke off the airflow the fire needs to breathe. So you take up the slice bar, work it under the crust of clinker, lever it up, and crack it apart while heat pours off the open firebox door directly into your face, your forearms, your chest, if you're not careful about where you stand. The old hands wear clogs down here instead of boots, because a fire that overflows or a hot coal that rolls free across the deck plates will burn straight through leather before you can react. Wood at least buys you a half second. You'll sweat more in this room than you knew a human body could produce. And that's the least of it. Coal dust settles into everything. Your throat, your eyes, the creases of your knuckles. And every breath in here comes seasoned with a fine black grit you'll be coughing up hours after your shift ends. You'll drink more water on a single shift than you normally drink in 2 days, and it still won't feel like enough. The kind of thirst that makes a man's hands shake a little by hour 8, right when steady hands matter the most. The noise never really stops either. The roar of the fire, the hiss of steam finding its way through some fitting that isn't quite tight enough, the clang of iron tools against iron plate. You stop noticing it the way you stop noticing your own heartbeat. That's not comfort. That's just what happens to a nervous system asked to run at this pitch for 10 hours straight. And through every minute of that exhaustion, through every blistered palm and clinker and cloud of black dust, one part of your attention is never, ever allowed to switch off. The gauge glass. Sweat in your eyes, shoulders burning, throat raw. Doesn't matter. You check the water level. You check it again. You check it after every firing cycle, every ash cleanout, every single time your attention has been pulled somewhere else for even a minute, because a minute is sometimes all it takes. This is where the job stops being about strength and starts being about discipline. And it's worth understanding that the men who did this for a living weren't unskilled laborers thrown into a pit. A good stationary engineer or fireman could read a fire the way a sailor reads weather, and factories that kept the same experienced man on staff for years generally didn't have problems. It was the boilers left in the hands of the inexperienced, the exhausted, or the improperly trained, where trouble tended to find its way in. On the morning of March the 20th, 1905, in a shoe factory in Brockton, Massachusetts, the man on duty was named David Rockwell. By every account collected afterward, he was capable, experienced, and doing nothing unusual that morning. An assistant engineer who'd left the boiler house only 5 minutes before the incident later swore the gauges showed safe pressure and plenty of water. Rockwell's own wife, watching from her kitchen window, saw him sitting calmly near the boiler house, the last untroubled glimpse anyone in his family would ever get of him. He never made it out. And here's the detail that should sit uneasily with you. Nothing he did wrong caused what happened next. Sometimes this job kills you for a mistake you made. Sometimes, and this is the part nobody wants printed on a training poster, it kills you for a mistake somebody else made 15 years earlier, sealed inside a riveted seam you were never given the chance to inspect. We're going to walk through that exact morning next, minute by minute, because it's the clearest answer anyone's ever going to give you to the question this whole video is built around. If you'd been the one standing in that room, would training, instinct, and every safeguard this era of engineering could offer have been enough to save you? The morning the factory in Brockton went up. Here's what you need to picture. Brockton, Massachusetts, March the 20th, 1905. Not a special day. A Monday, cold enough for coats, ordinary enough that nobody who walked into the Grover shoe factory that morning thought twice about it. More than 300 people worked inside that building, a 4-story wooden structure covering nearly an acre of ground, one of the largest shoe factories in a city that had built its whole reputation on shoes. Business was good. Production was up. The company had recently added an entire extra floor just to keep pace with demand for a brand of shoe sold in dozens of stores under a name people trusted. The boiler running that morning wasn't the newer one. It was the older backup, a boiler built back in 1890, pressed back into service temporarily while the primary unit underwent maintenance. 15 years old, riveted lap joints holding it together, the same design used in boilers all across the country, the same design with the blind spot you already know about. And there was a second problem, one that never showed up on any gauge. That older boiler had originally been sized for a 3-story building. The factory above it had grown to 4 floors. Nobody had gone back and asked whether a boiler built for 3 floors of demand was equal to the job of powering 4. David Rockwell's wife would later say her husband had seemed worn down in the days before the explosion, tired from having to run that older boiler at a pressure it wasn't comfortably built to handle. That's not a formal engineering finding. That's just a wife's memory of her husband coming home irritable. But sit with it anyway, because it's the closest thing anyone has to a warning sign, and it went exactly nowhere. Nobody adjusted the workload. Nobody pulled the older boiler from service. The factory needed steam. The newer boiler was down for repairs, and the older one would simply have to carry the weight until it wasn't needed anymore. At 7:50 in the morning, workers were still arriving for the day shift. Some were already at their stations. Some were still climbing the stairs, hanging up coats, finding their seats at machines that would run all day once the belts started turning. The assistant engineer had left the boiler house minutes earlier and later swore the pressure gauge and water gauge both looked completely normal. From her kitchen window nearby, Rockwell's wife saw him sitting near the boiler house, unhurried, doing exactly what a competent engineer does on an unremarkable Monday. Then the boiler let go. It didn't leak. It didn't groan a warning. It tore open with enough force to drive iron plates straight up through 3 floors of factory and out through the roof above it. And the shock wave of that failure took the building's own structural integrity down with it, floor after floor collapsing under the sudden loss of support, each falling floor adding its weight to the one below, until what had been a 4-story shoe factory a few seconds earlier was one flattened ruin. Workers who'd survived the initial blast now found themselves trapped beneath timber and collapsed machinery, unable to move, as fire began spreading through broken gas lines and a nearby shed where the factory stored naphtha and gasoline. The naphtha shed went up almost immediately after the boiler, throwing burning debris across the wreckage and igniting fires that spread faster than anyone could contain. People a half-mile away could hear the screaming. 58 people died that morning. Well over 100 more were injured. Some victims were never positively identified. The fire burned hot enough, long enough, that only fragments remained. And to this day, a number of names on the memorial in Brockton's Melrose Cemetery mark people whose identities were never confirmed. Rockwell himself was found the next day in the wreckage of the boiler house. A charred body, a bent pocket watch, 2 rubber heels, and a scrap of torn cloth his wife recognized from the window where she'd last seen him alive. Investigators moved fast, because the entire country wanted an answer. Was it low water, the failure you already understand, the crown sheet running dry, the fusible plug that should have warned him? The state's own boiler inspector checked exactly that. The fusible plug was intact. This wasn't a low water failure. This was the other kind, the quiet kind, the kind you were warned about earlier in this video. A crack had been growing, invisible, inside the overlap of 2 riveted plates, hidden from every inspection, because the flaw itself sat in a place no inspector's eye could reach. A manager from the company that insured and inspected the boiler said afterward that no carelessness had been found in its handling, that the explosion had been caused by a defect that simply could not be discovered by looking. Sit with that for a second, because it's the most unsettling answer this whole video has to offer. Rockwell didn't ignore a warning sign. He didn't let the water run low. He didn't skip a check or cut a corner. By every account, he was doing his job competently, watching his gauges, standing exactly where a good engineer is supposed to stand, and the room killed him anyway, because the flaw that ended his life had been hiding inside solid metal for 15 years, waiting for a Monday nobody could have predicted. That's your answer to the question this whole video keeps circling back to. Could you survive one shift in a boiler room? Some mornings, the honest answer is, it wouldn't have mattered how good you were. The Grover disaster wasn't an isolated nightmare either. Less than 2 years later, another Massachusetts shoe factory boiler, this one belonging to the Harney Shoe Company in Lynn, exploded in almost the same fashion. 2 catastrophic failures, in the same industry, in the same state, within 21 months of each other. That's not bad luck. That's a pattern. And patterns, eventually, force change. What it cost to make this room survivable. The Grover disaster did something none of the smaller, quieter explosions before it had managed to do. It made the public angry enough and scared enough to demand a fix that actually stuck. Massachusetts moved first. Within a few years of the Brockton explosion, the state established a board of boiler rules and passed the country's first serious law governing the operation and inspection of steam boilers. Real rules, with real enforcement, not just a suggestion pinned to a factory wall. Ohio followed with similar legislation not long after. Other states, watching the same headlines you'd have read that spring, began asking the same question. If this could happen in a modern shoe factory in a major American city, what exactly was stopping it from happening in ours? But state-by-state laws created their own problem. A boiler built to satisfy Massachusetts might not satisfy Ohio, and a manufacturer trying to sell equipment across state lines was stuck navigating a patchwork of conflicting rules with no common standard underneath any of it. So in 1911, the American Society of Mechanical Engineers formed a committee with one job: write a single, unified set of construction and safety rules that any state, any manufacturer, any factory owner in the country could adopt. Years of work later, in 1915, that committee published the first edition of the ASME Boiler and Pressure Vessel Code, a modest volume just over 100 pages that would eventually become the backbone of boiler safety across the entire country, and eventually much of the world. Even that first code wasn't the finish line. Different inspectors in different states still interpreted the same written rules differently, which meant a boiler certified safe in one place could still raise eyebrows in another. It took until 1919 for a national board of boiler and pressure vessel inspectors to be formed, giving the country something closer to one consistent standard of enforcement instead of dozens of local judgment calls. 14 years, in other words, between the morning Brockton went up and the point where a fireman anywhere in the country could reasonably trust that the rules protecting him actually meant the same thing wherever he worked. It didn't happen instantly, and it didn't happen for free. The men doing exactly your job in the years between Grover and that first code, the ones shoveling coal, watching gauges, trusting fusible plugs and gauge glasses with their lives, were the ones who paid for the gap between knowing this was dangerous and finally writing the rules down. Every safeguard you learned about earlier in this video, the mandatory inspections, the standardized safety valve testing, the slow phasing out of lap joints in favor of stronger construction, exists because rooms exactly like this one kept failing until enough people died that ignoring the problem stopped being an option. That's the trade this job made, whether anyone signed up for it consciously or not. The factories upstairs got their power. The country got its industrial revolution, its economic growth, its skylines full of smokestacks turning coal into progress, at a pace no other source of energy could match at the time. And down in rooms like this one, a workforce of firemen and stationary engineers absorbed the risk that made all of it possible, reading gauges, feeding fires, trusting devices that mostly worked, until the code finally caught up to a danger they'd been managing with nothing but skill and attention for decades. So, could you have survived one shift in a boiler room? If you'd had the training, the discipline, and more than a little luck, probably. Most shifts, on most days, in most boiler rooms, ended exactly the way they were supposed to. Tired, filthy, deafened, but alive. That was true for the overwhelming majority of men who did this job across the decades it mattered most. But you've also just walked through a morning where none of that was enough, where a good engineer, watching his gauges correctly, following every rule this era of engineering had given him, still didn't make it home, because the danger wasn't always something skill could outfight. Sometimes it was just physics, and pressure, and a crack nobody could see, sitting quietly inside metal, waiting for an ordinary Monday. They don't build boiler rooms like that anymore. Not because the fire got any less hungry, because we finally decided that the men who fed it deserved better than a gauge, a glass, and a prayer.